There was a man in that locker room that everybody quietly agreed on. It didn't matter who you asked. It didn't matter which era, which company, which side of the curtain they worked. Ask them who the smoothest wrestler alive was, who the safest hands belonged to, who could take a completely burned-out, jet-lagged, running-on-fumes body and drag a five-star classic out of it on a Tuesday night in front of 4,000 people who'd forget the town by morning. And you'd get the same answer over and over again. And there was one man who wouldn't just agree quietly. One man who said it out loud, on camera, in books, in interviews, for more than 30 years, refusing to let it go, insisting to anyone who would listen that the greatest pure wrestler he ever stepped into a ring with was not Hulk Hogan, was not Ric Flair, was not Shawn Michaels, insisting that this one particular guy should have been carried to the very top of the business and never was. That the industry looked directly at generational talent and decided it wanted something else. The case he never stopped making. That Curt Hennig was the best in-ring performer of his generation, that he was world champion material in a business that handed the crown to bigger men, that he sacrificed his own body to make Bret Hart a star and never got the return on it, and that he was a better man behind the curtain than almost anyone gave him credit for. But before any of that makes sense, you have to understand who was doing the talking. Because when Bret Hart tells you somebody is the best, that carries a specific kind of weight. Bret Hart did not deal in hype. In an industry built on exaggeration, he was the opposite. A technician who believed wrestling had rules, logic, and an internal sense that could not be faked. Raised by Stu Hart in Calgary's infamous dungeon, Bret learned to treat wrestling as a craft, and he judged everyone he worked with by that standard. He valued precision. He did not blow spots, hurt opponents, or take shortcuts and hope the crowd would not notice. His matches were built like arguments, with each hold leading naturally to the next and every finish feeling earned. He respected only a small group at the very top of the profession, and because his praise was so rare, it meant something. When Bret Hart called someone great, he was not being polite or feeding the hype. He meant they had met one of wrestling's highest standards. Now here is the other man. Curt Hennig was born on March 28, 1958, in Robbinsdale, Minnesota, and wrestling was in his blood before he ever chose it. His father was Larry Hennig, known to fans across the American Midwest as Larry the Axe, a big, tough, genuinely feared competitor in the old territory days. Curt grew up around the business, around the road, around the specific breed of hard men who made their living in it. He wrestled in high school, he was good at it, and when he turned professional in 1980, he was trained in part by Verne Gagne, the shooter who ran the American Wrestling Association, and in part by his own father. He learned it the real way, the old way, where you were expected to actually be able to wrestle, and he could. Almost immediately, everyone around him could see that Curt Hennig had something you cannot teach. Timing, fluidity, a body that did exactly what he told it to do, effortlessly, so that even the most complicated sequence looked like it was happening by accident. He tagged with a young Scott Hall in the AWA, and the two of them won the World Tag Team Championship. Hall would later say, flatly, that Curt Hennig was directly responsible for developing his career, that he learned how to actually work from watching and wrestling Curt. And that was a pattern that would repeat for the rest of Hennig's life. He made other people better. He made other people stars. He did it so smoothly that the people he elevated sometimes got all the credit for the climb. By the mid-1980s, the AWA had decided Curt Hennig was going to be its guy. There's a story from that period that tells you exactly how it happened. Hennig and Nick Bockwinkel, the smooth veteran champion, wrestled a full 60-minute draw, an hour of technical wrestling in front of a live crowd, and Greg Gagne, whose family ran the company, later said that single match was the thing that made Curt Hennig a star. 60 minutes, no rest, no hiding. Just two men wrestling and a young Curt Hennig proving he could hang with a master for an entire hour and hold an audience the whole way. After a performance like that, the direction was obvious. On May 2, 1987, at Super Clash, he defeated the legendary Nick Bockwinkel for the AWA World Heavyweight Championship. There was help involved, a roll of coins loaded into his hand courtesy of Larry Zbyszko, and controversy over the finish, and the title was even briefly held up before being awarded to him. But he had it. He was a world champion, and he turned villain in the process, and he held that belt for 373 days, one of the longest reigns in the entire history of the promotion. He carried a dying company on his back through its final good years. He proved he could headline. He proved he could draw. He proved he belonged at the very top. And then the AWA collapsed, the way the old territories were all collapsing, swallowed by Vince McMahon's national machine. And Curt Hennig did what the smart ones did. He went to New York, and that's where he became Mr. Perfect. And that's where Bret Hart got to work with him. And that's where the case began. When Curt Hennig arrived in the World Wrestling Federation in 1988, Vince McMahon looked at this impossibly gifted athlete and built a character around the one thing that was undeniably true about him. He was perfect. The gimmick was simple and brilliant. Mr. Perfect wasn't just a wrestler. He was flawless at everything. The company ran weeks of vignettes before his debut, showing him doing exactly that. Throwing a football and running down the field to catch his own pass. Sinking impossible shots. Bowling a strike, hitting a baseball with a professional, standing next to real athletes and outdoing them. The most famous of those featured Red Sox third baseman Wade Boggs, a detail that will matter, painfully, at the very end of this story. And then Mr. Perfect walked out onto WWE television, chewed his gum, snapped a towel, and backed the whole thing up, because unlike a lot of gimmicks, this one was standing on solid ground. The man really could do it. He wrestled an undefeated streak that ran deep into his early run, kept clean, and protected the way you protect something you plan to build on. He got Bobby Heenan as a manager, which put the finest heel talker in the business in his corner and made an already insufferable character irresistible to boo. He won the Intercontinental Championship, taking it off Tito Santana, and though he lost it to Kerry Von Erich at SummerSlam in 1990, he took it right back before the year was out with a little help from the $1 Million Man. He even brushed up against the very top, feuding with Hulk Hogan over the WWE Championship itself, standing across the ring from the biggest star on the planet and looking like he belonged there. He became one of the most hated and most watchable performers in the entire company, a man audiences paid money to see get beaten precisely because he was so infuriatingly, undeniably good. And somewhere in there, he started wrestling Bret Hart. And Bret Hart understood, right away, that he had found something rare. This is the first thing Bret was right about, that Curt Hennig was the best in-ring worker alive. Bret has explained it in a way that only another obsessive would bother to explain. He didn't just say Curt was good, he broke down why. He said Curt was safe, that you never got hurt working with him, that in a business where a careless opponent could end your career with one sloppy move, Curt protected you every single second. He said Curt was logical, that he never wasted a move, that everything he did in a match had a reason behind it, that every hold fed into the next one, that the whole thing built like a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. He said a lot of wrestlers working today would be better off if they simply sat down and watched Curt Hennig, because Curt understood the thing most of them never learned. That it isn't about what you do, it's about how you do it. They wrestled each other more than 60 times, across two companies across a decade from 1989 to 1998. And Bret described those matches in a way that tells you everything about the level Hennig operated at. He said there were nights he was completely burned out. Nothing left in the tank, exhausted from 8 hours stuck in an airport, dreading the walk to the ring. And then he'd realize he was working Curt, and it would be like getting the night off, because with Curt, he didn't have to carry anything. The two of them just clicked, and the match wrestled itself, and they'd walk back through the curtain having stolen the show without either of them feeling like they'd worked for it. That is a thing that almost never happens between two wrestlers. That is chemistry that comes along maybe once in a career, if you're lucky. Bret knew he was lucky. He said so, constantly. And the beauty of it was that the two characters were practically designed to collide. Mr. Perfect against the excellence of execution. Perfection against precision. Two men who each walked to the ring claiming, in their own way, to be the finest technical wrestler on the planet, and who then went out and made that claim into a story the audience could feel. When they locked up, you weren't watching two guys kill time until the finish. You were watching an argument about who was better, told entirely through wrestling, and the genius of it was that both of them were good enough to make you genuinely unsure of the answer. That was the whole appeal. Perfect would counter Bret, Bret would counter Perfect, and the crowd would lean further forward with every reversal, waiting to see whose mistake would finally end it. Almost nobody in the business could do that with Bret. Curt Hennig could do it in his sleep. Here's the problem. Being the best wrestler in the building was not, in that era, the thing that got you to the top of the building. The late 1980s and early 1990s WWE was a spectacle. It was cartoon superheroes and enormous painted men and characters you could sell to an 8-year-old on a lunchbox. Hulk Hogan was the standard. 24-inch pythons, red and yellow, the flag and the prayers and the vitamins. The Ultimate Warrior, sprinting to the ring, shaking the ropes, incoherent and enormous and beloved. That was what the machine was built to push. Size, look, presence you could see from the cheap seats. And measured against that, a smooth, compact, technically flawless craftsman who told beautiful stories on the mat was, to the people making the decisions, a wonderful piece to have in the middle of the card. A guy who could make anybody look good. A guy you put the Intercontinental title on. A guy who elevated the main eventers by working with them on the way up. Not the guy you crowned. Bret saw this happening. Bret was living it himself, watching his own perfect technical wrestling get treated as a mid-card feature while the top of the card went to men who couldn't lace Curt Hennig's boots inside a ring. And Bret kept saying it. That the business had its priorities backwards. That the guy who could actually wrestle was the guy you should build around. Nobody with the power to change it was listening. Not yet. But if you want the single clearest proof of what Curt Hennig was willing to give and what the business took from him without ever paying it back, you have to go to one specific night. A summer night in 1991. A night where Curt Hennig walked out and gave Bret Hart the biggest gift one wrestler can give another, while barely able to stand up straight. Because Mr. Perfect wrestled the most important match of Bret Hart's early career with a broken body. And almost nobody watching at home had any idea how badly he was hurt. In June of 1991, Curt Hennig was the Intercontinental Champion, riding what was arguably the best individual run of his WWE career. He was the longest reigning Intercontinental Champion of the entire decade. He'd beaten the Big Boss Man at WrestleMania. He was in a feud with the British Bulldog that was building towards something. He was, by every measure, at his absolute physical peak, moving like a man who could do this forever. And at a house show, one of the countless untelevised arena dates that were the real grind of the business, his back gave out. Reports over the years have described it as a herniated disc, a bulging disc, a broken tailbone, some combination of catastrophic damage to the lower spine. Whatever the precise medical language, the effect was the same. His body, the perfect instrument that had defined his entire identity, was broken. For most wrestlers, that's it. You go home, you heal. You let someone else finish the story, and the company already had the story planned. SummerSlam was coming on August 26, 1991, at Madison Square Garden. And the plan was for Bret Hart to step out of his tag team and become a singles star by taking the Intercontinental Championship off Mr. Perfect. It was Bret's coronation as a solo act. It was the launch of everything he would become. And Curt Hennig, who could barely move, refused to sit it out. Bret has told this story with something close to reverence. He's said that Curt was hurt, genuinely hurt, not the kind of hurt wrestlers work through all the time, but the kind that ends things, and that Curt wasn't even sure he could physically do it. And that Curt told him, over and over, "Don't worry, I'll be there. I'll be there for sure. I want to wrestle." That Curt wanted to be the one to hand Bret the ball on the biggest stage in the sport, at Madison Square Garden, at SummerSlam, in front of Bret's own parents who were sitting at ringside. Curt wanted that match so badly that he dragged his ruined spine to the Garden and went out there and did it. The match that resulted has been argued over for decades, praised as an all-time classic by a generation of fans, quibbled with by some who watched it live and thought it was merely very good. But that argument misses the actual miracle of it, which is that a man who could barely bend over went out and took bumps, took Bret's offense, sold, bridged, hit his perfect plex, made the whole thing feel like a war between two men who each believed they were the best technical wrestler on earth. And then he lost. Cleanly. He put Bret Hart over in the middle of the ring, tapped out to the sharpshooter, and handed the next decade of the company to the hitman. On a back that was, at that moment, effectively finished. Curt Hennig would not wrestle a real match again for over a year. That is the second thing Bret was right about, and he has said it plainly, without any of the false modesty that stars usually deploy. He has said that Curt Hennig made him, that Curt was one of the people who held the door open, that the SummerSlam match was the turning point of his entire career, the moment he stopped being one half of a tag team and became Bret Hart, and that it happened because a badly injured man chose to give him everything on his way out the door. And this is where you start to feel the shape of the injustice. Because in the story the business tells, SummerSlam 1991 is the birth of Bret Hart. The night the excellence of execution arrived. Bret's name is the one on it. And Bret, to his eternal credit, has spent the rest of his life pointing at the other man in the ring and saying, "No, you don't understand. He did that. He was hurt, and he did it for me." But the credit, the momentum, the run to the top, all of that flowed one direction, toward Bret. Curt Hennig gave away the thing he could never get back, and then he went home to try to fix a spine that would never be the same, and the machine simply moved on to its next star. Which brings us to the biggest thing Bret was right about. The thing that fans and wrestlers and journalists have argued about ever since. That Curt Hennig should have been a world champion in the WWE, and never was. Look at the timing, because the timing is almost cruel. In 1992, the WWE was in crisis. The steroid scandal had erupted, federal investigations, a culture of enormous chemically enhanced bodies, suddenly a public liability. Hulk Hogan stepped away. The Ultimate Warrior was gone. The era of the giant painted superhero was, for the moment, over, and the company needed a new kind of champion. A smaller, more athletic, more credible kind of champion. A wrestler, in other words. The exact thing Curt Hennig had always been. The exact thing Bret Hart had been screaming into the void that the business should have valued all along, and the company knew it. When they needed someone to take the World Championship off Ric Flair and carry the promotion into its next chapter, they looked at their roster of smaller, gifted technicians, and they made a choice. Shawn Michaels was considered too green as a singles act. And the crown, in the end, went to Bret Hart, who won his first WWE Championship in October of 1992 and became exactly the kind of champion the moment demanded. Now imagine that same moment with a healthy Curt Hennig on the roster. Imagine the timeline where his back never gives out at that house show in June of 1991. It is not a stretch. It is not fantasy booking. He was, before the injury, as good a wrestler as anyone in the company, arguably more charismatic on the microphone than Bret, a proven world champion who had already carried an entire promotion. If the WWE was pivoting to smaller, better workers, he was the platonic ideal of what they were pivoting toward. The world title run that went to Bret Hart could just as easily have gone to Mr. Perfect. In a lot of ways, it should have. The only thing standing between Curt Hennig and the top of the mountain was a spine that had already betrayed him, giving Bret Hart a leg up. Instead, when Hennig came back, his body could no longer be trusted. He returned in 1992, not as a wrestler, but as an executive consultant, standing at ringside for Ric Flair, feeding the machine from outside the ring, doing color commentary alongside Vince McMahon and Jim Ross, because that's what a broken back leaves you able to do. He'd wrestle sporadically after that, flashes of the old brilliance, a run against Lex Luger, a memorable meeting with Bret again in the 1993 King of the Ring, where Bret beat him in the semifinals. But he was never whole again. The window had closed. And the world title that a healthy Curt Hennig had every right to expect simply never came. He is remembered now, alongside Razor Ramon, as one of the 2 or 3 greatest wrestlers who never won a world championship in the WWE. The veteran journalist Bill Apter, a man who watched the entire era from the front row of history, said it as bluntly as anyone. He said he had no clue why Curt Hennig was never a world champion. No clue. Because from the inside, from the perspective of the craft, it made no sense at all. The man wore the Intercontinental Championship like it was a world title, elevated it, made it feel more important than the belt above it. And the belt above it stayed just out of reach for reasons that had nothing to do with whether he deserved it. Bret was right. World champion material walked past the front office every single day for years, and the front office handed the title to men it found easier to market. And by the time the industry's taste finally caught up to what Bret had been saying all along, Curt Hennig's back had already taken the decision out of everyone's hands. But being right about the wrestler was only half of what Bret understood about Curt Hennig, because there was a second half, a quieter one. And it might be the part that matters most. Bret Hart has never been shy about naming the people in wrestling he thought were selfish. He's talked more than once about wrestlers who reached the top and then pulled the ladder up behind them, who protected their own spot, who never once used their position to help the person coming up next. He's named names: Hulk Hogan, Jake Roberts, the Ultimate Warrior. Guys who, in Bret's telling, slammed the door shut the moment their own careers were secure and never did a thing for anybody after that. And then he draws the contrast. Every time. He puts two men on the other side of that line, the men who held the door open for him, who used their position to lift the next generation instead of guarding their own. One of them was Roddy Piper, and the other one was Curt Hennig. Think about what that means coming from Bret Hart, a man who by his own admission spent a career watching the top guys refuse to do favors for anyone. It means that in Bret's eyes, Curt Hennig was not just the best wrestler he ever faced. He was one of the very few genuinely generous ones. A guy who went out of his way to make his opponents look good, not because the script demanded it, but because that was who he was. A guy who taught Scott Hall the business. A guy who dragged a broken back to Madison Square Garden to launch someone else's career. A guy who, over 60-plus matches, gave Bret Hart the best nights of his working life and asked for nothing back except a good match in return. Everyone who worked with Hennig tells a version of this. Arn Anderson said that anyone who fought Curt Hennig had the best match of his life that night. That's the kind of thing that only happens when a wrestler is deliberately, generously working to make the other man shine. Shawn Michaels and Randy Savage both called him the best technical wrestler of his generation. These are not soft people. These are hardened, competitive men in a cutthroat business, and they agreed, without hesitation, on Curt. And still, none of it added up to the reward it should have. That's the maddening thread running through every part of this. The talent was recognized by his peers and ignored by his bosses. The generosity elevated everyone around him and never elevated him. He was the wrestler's wrestler, the one the other wrestlers pointed to, and the machine treated him like a very reliable role player. Bret kept saying it should be otherwise. Bret kept being right. And the years kept passing. They kept passing, and they got harder. When Curt Hennig's WWE run finally wound down and he left in 1996, he did what half the industry was doing at the height of the Monday Night Wars. He went to WCW, and there was still magic in him, even on a compromised body. He joined the New World Order, the biggest thing in wrestling. He was positioned for a while as the fourth member of a reborn Four Horsemen, alongside Ric Flair, the ultimate stamp of approval in that corner of the business. And then he detonated it. He turned on Flair and the Horsemen in one of the more memorable betrayals of the era, doing it in Flair's own backyard at a pay-per-view, slamming a steel cage door into Flair's head and joining forces with the group tearing the old guard apart. It was the kind of moment that got people talking, the kind of angle that could have launched a serious main event run for a younger man. But Curt Hennig was no longer a younger man, and the body that had to carry the run was the same broken one he'd been dragging around since 1991. He won the WCW United States Championship. He led a comedy stable of Southern brawlers called the West Texas Rednecks, whose anti-rap novelty song, of all the unlikely things, actually got radio play in the American South. He was still Curt Hennig, still smooth, still funny, still able to have a great match when the body cooperated. But it was a wrestler in the twilight, moving from angle to angle, from company to company, chasing a coronation that the business had already decided wasn't coming. The back never healed the way a back needs to. The wear accumulated. And the thing that a lot of people didn't see or didn't want to see was what a career of managing that kind of chronic pain does to a person over time. He came back to WWE one more time, in 2002. And for one night at the Royal Rumble, he reminded everyone. He was one of the last three men standing in the entire match, and he moved through it with flashes of the old timing, the old instinct, the old effortlessness. A 43-year-old man with a ruined back showing a locker room full of younger stars how it was actually done. For a moment, it looked like there might be one more chapter. There wasn't. Later that year, an altercation with Brock Lesnar on a flight home from the United Kingdom, on a plane that would become infamous in wrestling lore, cost him his job. He was released. He went to work for a smaller company, chasing another world title in another promotion, on the independent circuit, the place great wrestlers go when the big machines are done with them. And that was where the road was headed on February 10th, 2003. He was in Florida. He was supposed to wrestle. And in a hotel room in Brandon, near Tampa, Curt Hennig was found dead. He was 44 years old. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death acute cocaine intoxication. His father, Larry, the tough old axe who had trained him and wrestled beside him, spoke about it afterward with the unbearable honesty of a parent, and he pointed at the other things too. The painkillers, the steroids, the wear on a body that had been asked to do too much for too long. And you cannot tell this story honestly without drawing the line back to where so much of it started. To a spine that broke at a house show in June of 1991, that he then abused further by wrestling on it at SummerSlam to make another man a star, that never healed, that hurt for the rest of his life, that led to the painkillers that so many wrestlers of that generation leaned on to keep going. The injury that was the great turning point of Bret Hart's career was also, in a slower and crueler way, a turning point in Curt Hennig's life. It gave Bret the world. It took something from Curt that he never fully got back. The wrestling world came apart with grief. This was a man that everybody, on every side of every rivalry, seemed to actually love. Hulk Hogan spoke about what a good person he was. Ric Flair spoke about him. Bret Hart spoke about him. Macho Man Randy Savage, of all people, wrote and recorded an entire song about him called My Perfect Friend and put it on an album. WWE aired a video tribute on Raw with words from Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler. The company he'd bounced to at the end of his life displayed his singlet and his photo at their shows. Because whatever the front offices had failed to give him while he was alive, the people who actually knew him understood exactly what they had lost. One of the best all-around performers the business had ever produced. And a genuinely kind man underneath all of it. 4 years later, the wrestling business finally did what it so often does. It told the truth. Not quietly behind closed doors or in conversations between veterans, but publicly, under bright lights, on one of the industry's biggest stages. In front of thousands of cheering fans, Curt Hennig was celebrated as one of the finest performers professional wrestling had ever produced. His accomplishments were replayed, his greatest matches were remembered, and speaker after speaker praised his talent, professionalism, and influence on an entire generation of wrestlers. Everything Bret Hart had been saying for years was suddenly treated as undeniable fact. There was no longer any debate about Hennig's place in wrestling history. Nobody questioned whether he had been one of the greatest workers of his era or whether he possessed a level of in-ring ability that few could match. The industry had finally reached a consensus. Curt Hennig wasn't just remembered as Mr. Perfect. He was recognized as exactly what many of his peers had believed all along. One of the most complete professional wrestlers the business had ever seen. But that recognition carried an uncomfortable truth of its own. It arrived only after it no longer required any difficult decisions. It didn't mean changing championship plans, taking a chance on him as the face of the company, or giving him the opportunities he had spent years earning. It didn't require anyone to challenge old assumptions or rewrite the priorities that had shaped his career. By then, there was nothing left to risk and nothing left to sacrifice. In March of 2007, Curt Hennig was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. Wade Boggs, the baseball player from those perfect vignettes 2 decades earlier, the man who'd caught Mr. Perfect's football on television in 1988, stood up and inducted him. His wife and his 4 children and his parents accepted the honor on his behalf because he could not accept it himself. The same year, he went into the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame. The company put out a DVD celebrating his life and career, hours of footage and interviews and archival material. The whole apparatus of legacy making pointed at a man who'd spent his life being underrated in real time. His bloodline carried on in the ring too. His son Joe followed him into the business and eventually held the very same Intercontinental Championship his father had elevated, wrestling under the name Curtis Axel, a name stitched together from Curt and from his grandfather Larry the Axe, making the Hennigs one of the rare families to pass that title down through 3 generations of the same wrestling blood. His daughter Amy wrestled too. The name didn't die. The style didn't die. Young wrestlers today still study old Curt Hennig matches to learn how it's supposed to look, how a headlock takeover can be the prettiest thing in the world if you do it exactly right. The tributes rolled in, and every single one of them said in one form or another the exact thing Bret Hart had been saying for the better part of 20 years. That Curt Hennig was one of the greatest in-ring performers who ever lived, that he made everyone around him better, that he deserved more than he got. They were right. Eventually, years after Curt Hennig had wrestled his last match, the same people who once overlooked him finally began saying exactly what Bret Hart had been saying all along. They praised Hennig as one of the greatest in-ring performers of his generation, a wrestler who could elevate anyone, make every match believable, and leave an audience convinced they had witnessed something special. The problem was that these acknowledgments came far too late. The man they were talking about had been gone for years. He never got to hear the industry fully admit what Bret had recognized from the beginning. That is the real tragedy of being right too early, and it is why this story still matters. Bret Hart was never trying to create controversy or defend a close friend out of loyalty. He was simply describing what he saw every time he shared a ring with Curt Hennig. From the moment they first wrestled in the late 1980s, Bret believed Hennig was the best all-around wrestler in the business. Not because of his charisma alone or because of flashy moves, but because he possessed the rare ability to make every opponent look like a bigger star than they really were. He could wrestle anyone, adapt to any style, and make even an average performer look exceptional. Hennig had already proven he could carry an entire promotion during his time in the AWA. In the WWF, he spent years sacrificing his own body and momentum to help create new stars, often making others look better than himself. Yet while he was doing that, the biggest opportunities consistently went to larger, more marketable names. Size, image, and corporate expectations repeatedly outweighed pure wrestling ability. Then, years later, the wrestling world finally admitted what Bret Hart had known all along. Curt Hennig had been one of the greatest talents of his era. The recognition was sincere, but it arrived after his career was over and after his voice had been permanently silenced. Sometimes the hardest part about being right isn't proving your point. It's waiting long enough for everyone else to catch up. He said it. Nobody with the power to fix it listened. And the vindication, when it came in the form of a posthumous plaque. And maybe that's the part that lingers the longest. Professional wrestling has always been remarkably good at celebrating the people it has already lost. It produces emotional tribute videos, fills arenas with standing ovations, inducts legends into the Hall of Fame, and reminds fans just how important those performers really were. The speeches become heartfelt, the documentaries become glowing, the flaws are softened, the accomplishments grow larger, and the industry finally says all the things it should have said years earlier. But that generosity rarely arrives when those same wrestlers are still alive to hear it. Curt Hennig became another example of that pattern. During his career, he was respected by his peers but often overlooked when the biggest opportunities were handed out. He was trusted to make others look like stars, trusted to rescue difficult matches, and trusted to deliver whenever the pressure was highest. Yet being the wrestler everyone relied on was not the same as being the wrestler everyone rewarded. The recognition he truly deserved always seemed to be waiting for another day. After his passing, everything changed. The industry embraced his legacy without hesitation. He received the Hall of Fame induction. His career was celebrated through documentaries, tribute packages, and countless interviews with wrestlers who called him one of the greatest they had ever stepped into the ring with. Fans who had watched him for decades proudly kept his memory alive, while a new generation discovered his work through archived matches and WWE retrospectives. His son, Joe Hennig, even carried the family name into the wrestling business, ensuring that the perfect legacy continued for years after Curt was gone. But not one piece of it could give him back the world title run that a healthy body would have earned him, or the years the injury stole, or the recognition that arrived a decade and a half after the man who deserved it had stopped needing anything from anyone. Bret Hart understood the value of Curt Hennig, while it still could have mattered. The industry understood it at a funeral. There's a line Bret uses when people ask him the fantasy question, the one every retired wrestler gets. If you could come back for one more match, one final night, who would you want to cross the ring from you? The answers are usually predictable. A big name, a famous rivalry, a marquee moment. Bret's answer never changes, and it isn't any of those things. He says Curt Hennig. His own brother Owen, who died young and whom Bret loved beyond words, is a close second. But the first name out of his mouth every time is Curt, the favorite opponent he ever had. The one he'd choose over anyone, living or dead, for one last match. He'll tell you he could wrestle Curt Hennig with nothing in the tank and steal the show. He'll tell you it's not about what you do, it's how you do it. And Curt understood that better than anyone. He has been telling people this for 30 years, and he is still telling them now, long after almost everyone else finally caught up to what he was saying. Because that's the thing about Bret Hart and Mr. Perfect. Bret wasn't wrong. He was never wrong. He was just early and alone, and shouting about a truth that the business found inconvenient right up until the moment it became a eulogy. Curt Hennig was the best wrestler a lot of people ever saw. He should have been a world champion. He gave away more than he ever received. And the man who saw all of it clearest, who said it loudest, who refused to stop saying it, was standing there the whole time, telling anyone who would listen. Almost nobody did. Until it was safe. Until it was sad. Until it was carved onto a Hall of Fame wall next to a man who could no longer read his own name. If this story hit you the way it hit us, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the wrestlers the business got wrong, because there are more of them than anyone wants to admit, and somebody should keep saying their names.